Somebody had asked how I make my chopstick blanks for my Bridge City Chopstick Master. Today I'm going to show you how I do that. Start by cutting an 11-inch section of whatever hardwood you want to use. Run one edge over the jointer, you can plane it if you want. And then you want to set your table saw fence about 9/32 from the outside edge of your saw blade. I like to use a Freud thin rip glue line blade. I think they call it their industrial series or whatever. It's not super important what type of blade other than that it can give a decent rip cut. For this operation in particular, I like the thin blade just because I'm not wasting as much of the wood, and some of the wood I use for chopsticks is expensive, so if I can maximize the blanks that I get from a specific piece, then all the better. For the first couple of passes, I set the blade just a little higher than the thickness of the wood, and then I put my freshly jointed edge against the fence, of course. Grab my micro jig gripper, and for this first cut, this stabilizer side, I kind of slide up out of the way, just because there's so much wood here that doesn't need it. And then from here, just rip as many strips out of that piece of wood as you're comfortable doing. Just kind of rinse and repeat. And eventually I do lower that stabilizer arm. And I usually end up with a piece about 1 by 1 that, I don't know, just gets a little too small. Save that to make pens or something. And from here, you've got a whole bunch of strips now that will give you 2 chopsticks each. Next, lower the blade so it's just barely above the strips that we've just cut. Next, slide a few of these strips up against the fence and put the gripper on top so that you can adjust the height of that stabilizer bar and the little drop-down foot on the rear. Slide your first strip up against the fence, get the gripper in place, run it through once, slide the offcut up against the fence, run it through again, and just rinse and repeat for all the other blanks that you've cut. So basically each one of these strips that you made from that 4/4 piece, assuming you're starting with 4/4 lumber, each one of these strips will give you 2 chopstick blanks and 1 piece of scrap. That I saved these because I figure someday I'll come up with something that I can make out of them, but so far I haven't, but who knows. Anyway, here's your chopstick blanks. Since I cut this at 11 inches, they are a little bit too long. I do that on purpose because sometimes I end up with these little nibs on the end. By having these just slightly too long, I can then trim these to the final length that I want, either with a crosscut sled on the table saw, but what I more generally do is I just use my Japanese saw to cut these to the same length as the blanks that were supplied with my Chopstick Master. And so what you end up with is a chopstick blank that's 11 inches long and just over 1/4 of an inch square, which is just about perfect. This is a stock one from the factory, and the ones that Bridge City supplies and the thickness that the jig is set up for is 7mm. These are just a hair under. And then by cutting to this dimension, we've got one that is just a hair over, which works out pretty well because you have enough extra wood that you're able to plane out the saw marks without having to go through a drum sander or something else first. So that's basically how I make my chopstick blanks. I think the biggest thing to watch for when you're making these is just to make sure you've got a good hold on your gripper and that it's got the piece of wood nice and tight up against the fence. Otherwise, you know, if it's off by a little bit, you may end up with a blank that's a little too thin on one end. Like this one here, actually, it's fine on this side. On this side, it's a little thinner. I don't think it would really make a whole lot of difference. I think it would still work out fine, especially if you were doing a 3mm chopstick instead of a 5. But just something to watch for. As far as wood choice, really just about any hardwood I think is going to work. Most of the chopsticks I make are kind of limited to maple, walnut, red heart, and padauk. Those are I just like how they turn out. They're nice and hard. Seem to wear pretty well so far. But really, I mean, you could make them out of pine if you wanted to. They just might not be that good. I don't know. Anyway, if you like making chopsticks, especially with the Bridge City Chopstick Master, hopefully this was helpful, because this is cheaper by quite a bit than buying them from Bridge City, and gives you a little more variety as far as lumber choice, because really, since you're making your own, you can use whatever lumber you want. If you don't use the Chopstick Master, if you have some other way that you make them, I imagine these would probably still work just fine cut like this. Anyway, hope that was helpful. Thanks for watching. If you want to see more of the things that I do in my shop, please subscribe, and we'll see you next time. There is a tiny bee in my shop.